Matt, thank you.
We talked about smart shopping today. We're going to turn our attention now to smart motorways, because they're designed to help sort of ease traffic congestion through variable speed limits and using the hard shoulder as an extra lane during busy times.
But a survey of AA members has ranked so-called smart motorways joint second among the most dangerous roads in the country.
This comes as Highways England has promised to increase lay-bys in order to improve safety. We shall discuss all this in a moment and hopefully get some of your opinions on it as well. But first, let's take a look at how smart motorways work.
Motorways are becoming smarter to help traffic flow smoother. For instance, when a lane is closed for safety reasons, you'll now see a red X clearly displayed, and you'll need to move into another lane. Signs will show when the lane has reopened, and you can use it again. Normally, if your car breaks down, you just pull over into the hard shoulder. But now the hard shoulder can become a driving lane, and you'll have to come off at the next services, exit, or emergency refuge area, which are every 1.5 miles.
Well, that was from the Highways Agency. So we're talking about smart motorways now. What do people think of them? We're joined by Paul Hutton, who's the editor of Smart Highways magazine. Hello.
Morning.
Anne Helsby, whose cars broke down on a stretch of the motorway where there was no hard shoulder. We'll come to that story in a moment,
Okay.
Anne. And the president of the AA, Edmund King, is also in our London studio. You've done this research, Edmund King, and people, it seems, are quite concerned. Is it because we're just not accustomed to these motorways?
Well, I think the main concern is that if people actually break down on a smart motorway and if they can't see an emergency refuge area, they're then stuck in a live lane where the advice is put on your hazard lights and dial 999. Now, obviously, if you can move over to the left-hand side, if there is a gap, and if it is possible to get out of the left-hand side of the road, you can. But we've seen a lot of instances on smart motorways on the M1 and the M3, if you look in local press cuttings, where that's happened and another vehicle's come along and smashed into the back. And that is the concern. We've argued for 5 years that you need twice as many lay-bys on smart motorways. If a driver can see a lay-by ahead of them, 95% will get to that lay-by. If they can't see a lay-by, 55% will only drive half a mile, and then basically they're just sitting ducks.
OK, well, let's put that to Anne, because you can hopefully tell us about your experience. What happened to you on a smart motorway?
We broke down on the M42 last June, hottest day of the year. We were very fortunate we were just by a refuge area. There was already a lady at the end of it. We drove in and managed to stop before we hit her. We were there for 2.5 hours. There was absolutely nowhere to stand, enough room to get out of the car, and then there was a bar, and then there was about 12 inches. It was 30+ degrees. We had the dog in the car. We couldn't even get him out. My husband had to stand with the back door wide open, kind of facing the road. When I got home, we were there for 2.5 hours. The AA came and moved the lady in front of us. We went in the AA, and he said, "You can't stay here. It is so dangerous." And he got us off the motorway, wrote to Highways England and the Transport Department, and said, why didn't the traffic officers help us? And the answer was, well, you weren't an emergency, you were perfectly safe. Well, no, we weren't. Traffic whizzing past us, nowhere to stand. You couldn't get away from the car. We were like sitting ducks if anything had hit us.
Well, you both echoed the same thing. Paul Hutton, you're from Smart Highways. You know, they're presumably, do you see a benefit in smart motorways? And what about this point about being sitting ducks?
I completely agree. In fact, one of the things when I first wrote about smart motorways was what Edmund said, which was I thought that the refuge areas needed to be closer together. The issue is we've got a capacity problem and we've got a budget problem. So trying to build our way with more lanes on a motorway would be the ideal thing to do, but there just isn't the budget there for it. So consequently, using technology to monitor the way people are moving along the roads. There are cameras that will see if you've stopped. There are radar to check you've stopped. In theory, and it doesn't always happen, but in theory, then the red X's should go up above the running lanes. People should be warned about the problem, and therefore you should be safe. And there's an awful lot more technology than there would be on a normal, old-fashioned stretch of motorway when, if you're on the hard shoulder, you're in a dangerous position, even if you've got that lane to yourself.
Edmund King, that's the harsh reality, isn't it? There isn't that money to spend on, and probably not the appetite as well, to spend that money on widening motorways everywhere.
Yeah, I think the problem is if there'd been a consultation on this after the M42 experiment, you know, we said straight away you need twice as many refuge areas. If they're built in at the earliest stage, it is much more cost effective. And the problem currently is we're not getting the congestion benefits because 38% of drivers do not use the inside lane on a smart motorway because they are worried that there will be a broken down vehicle in front. And then if there is a broken down vehicle and if a red X comes up, you're then putting out 1 or 2 lanes of traffic, which causes immense congestion. Whereas if that vehicle can get off into a lay-by or indeed onto a hard shoulder, it doesn't cause congestion. So really, we need to go back to the drawing board here. Motorists are worried, we're worried. We've been consistent in calling for twice as many lay-bys. We know Highways England are looking at it, but we still haven't seen the full report about what they're proposing to do about it.
Yeah, well, just a couple of days ago, and you'll know this, Edmund, Highways England gave this announcement saying they're planning to increase the number of emergency lay-bys on smart motorways. Spacing between refuge areas, now about 1.5 miles, will be reduced to 1 mile to provide a greater reassurance to motorists. More lay-bys will be added to roads in areas with the most breakdowns. They also said they're going to, give them bright orange surfaces and other things as well, including radar. But Anne, just really briefly, what would have helped you in that instance, do you think, most?
I think the traffic officers passed us,
Right.
and because we weren't an emergency. And the other thing we didn't know, because we didn't know, you're supposed to use the SOS phone. Well, we used our mobile, as did the woman in front.
Right,
so,
and you should have used the phone that was in the lay-by.
Yeah, but I still think they wouldn't have come to us, because what both the Highways Agency and the Transport Department say is actually, you're not an emergency. Well, sorry, if they'd been stood there with all these boats and caravans and stuff whizzing past, they might have thought differently.
Thank you all very much for coming to talk to us.
Good to talk to you all. And thanks for your comments as well. Alan saying to anyone who's driven on these, particularly at peak times, they're anything but smart, very discomforting to drive on. I'll do my best to avoid them. And Vicky says variable signs on motorways are not very smart at the moment, usually aren't accurate or believed, says Vicky.
Thank you very much for being in touch. So right now, let's get the news, the travel and the weather wherever you're watching us. We'll have the headlines here at 8.